Hello and welcome back to the Brussels Signal studio. Today we have Billy Kelleher. Welcome, Mr. Kelleher. Thanks for coming to see us. Mr. Kelleher is the Fianna Fáil MEP from Ireland, and Fianna Fáil is part of the ruling coalition in Ireland, and the Fianna Fáil MEPs sit with the Renew group, the Liberal group in the European Parliament. Let's get straight down to it. Today is October the 10th, and the news around the world, but here in Brussels in particular, is obviously the new war between Hamas and Israel. Today and yesterday in particular, there has been a slightly strange situation in that the European Commission announced yesterday that they were suspending all aid to Palestine because of the, quote, brutality, unquote, of the Hamas attacks. And then overnight and this morning, they did a complete U-turn, in part in response to governments such as yours. If I'm not mistaken, the Irish government was one of the first to state that suspending aid would be wrong. What happened, do you think? Well, why the U-turn?
Well, I think the U-turn came about simply because, governments in Europe were very concerned about the Commission's original announcement. It was a unilateral announcement by one commissioner. You prefaced your remarks by saying at the start, this is a war between Israel and Hamas. You know, we have to accept that there are huge numbers of Palestinian people living in the West Bank and in Gaza who just want to get on with their everyday lives. They're struggling as it is. Withdrawing humanitarian aid, withdrawing other forms of aid would, in my view, have been punishing an entire population for the appalling atrocities carried out by Hamas. So, Israel has a right to defend itself. It has a right to protect itself. And, it is going after Hamas. But we have to, make sure that people, ordinary people going about their lives who are already struggling under very poor conditions are not further discriminated against and abused by the European Union withdrawing funds. So that was the main reason, I thought it was an overarching reaction by the Commission in the first place.
So it was sort of a knee-jerk reaction, or did they make a decision and then go back? Do you have any feeling as to why? It's very odd to do a complete U-turn overnight.
Well, it looked like it was an announcement by one individual commissioner.
Okay.
And then, governments got onto the Commission saying, what is this about? I know that other governments, but the Irish government was very forceful in saying you cannot, punish an entire population for Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation. And we have to also accept that, Israel has been attacked by a terrorist organisation. It has a right to defend itself, but equally, we need proportionality and restraint in terms of attacks on the Palestinian civilian population.
Okay, I guess maybe the Commission should have asked the national governments before it made its announcement. Or communication problem, I don't know what.
Yeah, well, look, at the end of the day, the Commission sometimes does make decisions that, it has to roll back and it doesn't get everything right, and that is for certain. But this was certainly a knee-jerk reaction, in my view. It was badly thought out, if it was thought out at all, and it's something that we should insist does not happen. That big decisions like this about withdrawing aid that has been sanctioned already by the Council, by the Parliament, that one individual commissioner could unilaterally make that announcement, in my view, is undermining the democratic process of the European Union and, conferring too much power on an individual rather than even on the collective Commission itself.
Okay. So Ireland, is it fair to say that Ireland is pro-Palestine? Is that a fair statement?
Well, what it is it supports the two-state solution. It supports the peace process. It has always advocated for the Palestinian people. Let's be under no illusions. The Palestinian people are a persecuted people as well. They have been corralled into certain areas like the Gaza Strip, large parts of the West Bank. I visited the West Bank. I've walked through the West Bank. It is an occupied territory.
Okay.
The Israelis are continually encroaching with further illegal settlements. And they're illegal settlements, not in my eyes, in the eyes of international law. They're illegal settlements, and they continue to encroach. So we've always called for restraint from the point of view of, attacks from either the Palestinian authorities into Israel and vice versa. But we do need to move to a point where there's recognition of Palestine as a state, and that it is supported, and that it is no longer being allowed to be undermined, and that Israel sort of has this ability just to ignore international law, ignore international opinion, and do as it wants to do against the Palestinian people. But then on the flip side, it shows the fear that Israel lives under when you have 900 people killed.
Right.
900 people slaughtered, gunned down by a terrorist organisation that came out of Gaza as well. So we have to be conscious of of the right of Israel to defend, but equally of the right of Palestinians to their own homeland.
And is it true that this is not a party political issue in Ireland, that there is broad consensus on this?
Well, I think there's broad consensus among the centre, that we want a balance. I mean, a lot of people on the left, for example, would just advocate that, Palestine has a right to exist. I would say it has a right to exist, but equally, Israel has a right to defend itself. And it's to get that balance right.
Okay.
And we must put obligations on the Palestinian Authority and others who advocate for Palestine as well to make sure that they condemn the Hamas attacks, that they condemn the terrorist attacks coming out of their territories. And if we can just move to a point, which is very difficult in the heat of what is happening there, with huge attacks into Israel, 900 people killed, and now we have massive aerial bombardment of Gaza, which will clearly, kill a lot of civilians as well. So we do need restraint. It's something that we just have to get restraint and then just get some form of dialogue. But longer term, I mean, we have to get to a stage where we believe a two-state solution is the only way to resolve this. And that can only be done about if you have a viable state for the Palestinians. And the Israelis at the moment are intent on undermining that. Not at the moment, but they've been doing it for years. And now we're looking at it through a very urgent prism because of the war between Israel and Hamas.
Okay. I mentioned that obviously because it's news, and I know that you've talked about it. Another subject that I'd like to bring up, because you've been very vocal on this one as well, and that's the EU-Mercosur deal. Now, this is the deal between Europe and South American countries, which has implications for farmers, and in particular Irish farmers. You believe that this is bad news for your constituents, is that correct?
Well, I just believe that if we go ahead with the Mercosur deal as envisaged, it will do nothing in terms of the climate obligations that we've agreed in the European Union and that we're trying to set across the entire world through the Paris Agreement. So, from my perspective, I am in favour of liberal trade deals. But there has to be equality in this. There has to be an understanding that if you are to have a trade deal with another trading bloc, both should benefit. And there shouldn't be a detrimental impact either on indigenous people or on the environment. And I'm just concerned that the Mercosur agreement, as envisaged, will allow access to the big markets in South America that are growing, particularly the Brazilian market, which is huge, for European engineering and European manufacturing. And that we will be taking from Brazil primarily beef and soy and other things, which will incentivize the destruction of the Amazonian rainforests, which is clearly something we don't want to happen. So I just believe that, if you're going to incentivize the potential destruction of what we're trying to protect, it doesn't make sense.
So it's more an environmental issue than an issue for Irish farmers?
Well, it impacts in Ireland as well, because if we have different standards, so like in Ireland and across Europe, we're potentially, because of policy development, asking farmers to reduce their herd numbers. And at the same time, a trade deal will incentivize a major increase in the Brazilian herd number, plus reduction or the destruction of the rainforest, to grow crops and to graze cattle. And like the Brazilian herd is 225 million animals. And they're talking about increasing this by another 10% in the next number of years. And at the same time, we have to ask European farmers to reduce herd size.
It doesn't
in my
make
view,
sense.
it doesn't make sense. And I just think we have to look at it from another way.
And where are we with this deal? Because if I'm not mistaken, it's almost ratified, but not quite. Is that where we are?
It's a long way to go, because this has to be ratified by all national parliaments as well. So it's a long way off. I don't sense at the moment that the council could agree to it, and certainly there's going to be strong objections from some national governments with regard to the way it's structured at the moment.
So you're in favour of a rewrite, or?
Yeah, I just think at the moment there's too much emphasis put on, just access to markets without looking at the impacts that they will have on the environment. We've had, when Bolsonaro was there, certainly the undermining of indigenous people, maybe it might have improved with De Silva now as president, but it was big business, it was agribusiness, corporations, moving people off lands that were historically theirs, indigenous people, and destroying rainforests, which at the same time we are trying to encourage those countries to protect rainforests as well. So it's just to get the balance right. And we have obligations under the Paris Agreement.
Right.
And so do other countries. And I just don't think this particular proposal, as outlined, will do that.
So you hope it doesn't go through in that case?
As it's structured, I would be very opposed to it, yes.
Okay, okay. Now, something else which has an environmental side to it is nuclear power. Now, Ireland is traditionally anti-nuclear power, correct?
Yes.
But you have a more nuanced stance. Are you pro-nuclear power?
Well, there's a reality here in the European Union that half of our carbon-free electricity is generated by nuclear power. Half are carbon-free. So we will never meet our climate obligations unless we have nuclear power across the European Union. The Irish economy is a small economy in the overall scheme of things in terms of electricity requirement. But we are linking into the European Union with interconnectivity from France to Ireland. We're connected into the UK as it is. So we're going to be purchasing and using, and already are using, nuclear-generated electricity.
Okay.
Slovakia, for example, which is a country of similar size in terms of population to Ireland, has 3 nuclear power plants and is commissioning more. The technology has moved on quite rapidly. They now can go for these modular type of nuclear reactors that actually create electricity, in a more structured way rather than the big, massive engineering plants that were required in previous times. So I'm just saying we shouldn't rule out these things. They should be part of our discussions about how we meet our climate obligations and ensure that Ireland has security of energy supply into the future. Bear in mind, we're reducing, obviously rightly, our dependence on coal, on oil, and ultimately on gas, and we want to transition to clean, carbon-free electricity generation.
So nuclear might be part of that mix. That's what you...
I just think it should be considered. Because, so we have wind energy, which we did primarily the mode of how we will generate electricity in the years ahead, solar as well. But there are times when, the volatility of wind energy and solar energy, you might need other forms.
Right.
At the moment, we provide that by gas. I just don't think that's long-termly sustainable.
Okay, but this is not the position of the government.
In fact, no, it's not, because we actually have legislation on the statute books in Ireland, passed by the Parliament, which actually forbids the production of nuclear energy in Ireland. But, definitely the science, the technologies are evolving. And, I suppose from an Irish perspective, we probably don't look at it through the same prism as they do in Europe, but 13 of the 27 countries are nuclear powered and, generate electricity from nuclear. So it's not an unusual energy source across the European Union.
Okay, and are you in a small minority in your country, or are things changing?
Well, look, it's not that there's this huge national debate on it, but I just think that, I just want to stimulate a debate on this particular issue, just for us to look at energy options into the future as technologies evolve and how the size of the nuclear generating plants that are now being produced vis-a-vis in previous times. And we do look at nuclear energy and production of energy and nuclear power in Ireland through, I suppose, older eyes in terms of, the great concern between nuclear wars between the United States and Europe or Russia years ago, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and obviously Chernobyl as well.
Right.
But if you look at the safety in terms of nuclear in the European Union and in the UK, well, it answers itself.
Are you a lone voice in Ireland, or do you have some support?
I think there's an element of people that are looking at this. I'm not looking at it from an emotional perspective, and I understand there's huge emotions in this, but I just think that it should be just part of our discussion.
Okay. Can we talk for 2 minutes about media freedom? Now, you have talked you're in favour of media freedom. You've talked out against concentration of media ownership. This is a touchy issue here in Brussels at the moment because there is some legislation going through which already has given the European Commission powers to intervene as far as social media platforms are concerned. Where do you stand on that, please? Should the European Commission have the power to switch off social media platforms?
Well, switching off now, the European Commission itself switching off, I think, would be a concern. But what we want to do is to have plurality of, editorial content on our media platforms. That's both print media and digital media. We can't have a situation where just a number of people control, through monopolies first and foremost, but then the editorial content on those platforms. And that would be very dangerous in my view. I mean, the basic essence of democracy is people being able to vote, but being able to vote knowing the full facts of information. Mm-hmm. And that requires a plurality of media outlets and media content and media editorial input.
Right. Are you talking about plurality online and offline, or what are you referring to exactly?
Yes, online and offline. I mean, I just think it is critically important. You can't have a situation where you have, a monopoly of media, but then the owners of that media, interfering in a very direct way with the editorial content of what is being published.
Or algorithms.
Well, yes, or algorithms in the
Right.
digital space, yes.
Right.
I mean, look, and we have seen that in some countries. We saw it with Murdoch, for example. Let's be honest, let's be very, very clear about it. I mean, there was huge editorial interference and a direction taken by the papers that Murdoch had ownership over. There's no point in us pretending that. That's a reality. So I mean, we have big media platforms as well. We have digital platforms that an awful lot of people only use for their information or their access to information. And I just think there has to be some obligation that there's a veracity to what's on it, and that there is multiple sources of information.
So I guess that's two different issues, though, isn't it? What the multiple sources, you mean, what do you mean? How can you ensure that there are multiple sources?
Well, I mean, in the event of you just getting onto a platform and it only going to one individual search engine that is, influenced by the owner of that content, for example, would be, or the owner of that media outlet, would, in my view, would be a very, very dangerous position to be in. That we would actually have people who are going on to a platform, they're searching, but they are being directed specifically to individual content that is influenced by the person who has
these big search engines, big media platforms have too much power.
Well, they have a lot of power, yes.
And so what's the solution? Break them up?
Well, I mean, we do already have some legislation passed in the Digital Service Act and other areas of the European Union where, there is certain regulatory obligations being placed on platforms. And I think that is going to continue to evolve.
Okay.
Just like in the print media, there is certain obligations when you print something in the traditional print media.
Right.
It has to be accurate, it has to be honest, it has to be fair.
Or there's a redress in the court.
Well, there's a redress in the courts, yes. Yeah.
But I mean, so how about, though, the idea that a bureaucracy such as the European Commission can intervene?
Yeah, well, I mean, the European Commission, you say it's a bureaucracy, but it is made up of a democratic process. The Commission cannot do anything on its own without the consent of the Parliament.
But they can implement. They can implement the laws.
And 20. Well, no, they can't. The Commission can't implement any laws on its own. The Commission can only initiate laws. The laws are passed by the European Parliament and by the Council. It's only then that the Commission implement the consequences of those laws.
Right.
So there is democratic input.
Okay, I'm just wondering, I mean, we had, for example, there was a Pirate Party member sitting in your seat not long ago who was convinced that the European Commission should not be given power over social media platforms because he said that these are just a way of for people to exchange information, and therefore he was against
but exchanging information between individuals, one person to another person. But if there is a full if there's a monopoly, number one, in a place. In other words, if there's no access to information by other providers, that is a significant issue. And then if that is the only avenue and the full editorial decision-making process is made by those same people, well, I just have concerns about that. I just believe in the plurality of media, that there should be diverse content, diverse opinion. And as time goes on, you can see it beginning to shrink into a number of very large conglomerates, but at the top of those conglomerates very often can be individuals. And I just case in point earlier on, even when it was in print media, the Murdoch.
And what's the situation in Ireland as far as media concentration is concerned?
Well, I mean, it's quite diverse. I mean, in many ways it's quite diverse. There was, Dennis O'Brien would have had a lot of media influence over the years, but I mean, that has whittled away to a certain extent now. Again, local, you have plenty of radio stations, you have plenty of local media, print media, electronic media. So it's quite diverse. It's quite a diverse space, and it's a very dynamic space. And it's good for democracy. It's just good for democracy. It holds people's attention and interest, and it also holds politicians and political life to account as well.
Okay, so the concerns that you have are more addressed at online platform search engines on a Europe-wide level. This is not an Ireland-specific.
No, it's not Ireland-specific at all. In fact, I think Ireland would be, considered a reasonably diverse in terms of media content and outlets.
Oh, okay. European elections next year. What are your predictions? We've had different people and all kinds of predictions from the people who've come to the Brussels Signal studio. Some people, especially before the summer, were talking about a shift to the right and maybe the formation of a right-wing bloc. We've also had other people saying, well, the traditional alliance between the Social Democrats and the European People's Party maybe will break down. There'll be all kinds of alliances, ad hoc alliances formed. And some people are saying that, in fact, this talk of the shift to the right is over the top. It's not going to happen. And as we may have seen in Spain, what's your predictions?
Well, I mean, it's very hard to predict a final outcome. But I mean, what I sense that, and this is only looking from the prism of the European Parliament itself now, and the makeup of the European Parliament, rather than individual, member state national elections.
Right.
I think the centre it's critically important that the centre holds.
Okay.
And I think it's going to potentially be a redefining of the centre, because if too many political groupings start drifting to the right, they're going to lose some of their own support base, both in terms of the electorate, but equally possibly in terms of MEPs.
Right.
I just think that, if there's a lurch to the right among the political groupings inside in the European Parliament, I think that could have an effect of, a certain grouping or groups finding it difficult to hold their entirety on the right.
Right.
Because I think the centre has a very valuable space to defend, and it's critically important. So that would be an area.
Traditionally, that's where the European Parliament is, right? We have basically a central alliance at the moment.
Yeah.
You think that will hold post-election?
Well, put it this way. I mean, you could say the right of S&D, Renew, and the left of EPP is the centre. If the EPP try to drag themselves right, I think they could lose an element of their support, either from the public during the election, but if they try to shift to the right in the Parliament afterwards, they could lose membership.
Okay, so it won't work, basically.
Well, I certainly hope it doesn't.
Right, okay.
I think it's important that the centre holds, as I said, and lurching to the right or lurching to the left is not the centre.
Now, maybe we could end on just for a couple of minutes on Irish politics. I'm keen to learn. As you know, we have a couple of Irish journalists here on the Brussels Signal, so I have been learning a lot. Will there be a Sinn Féin government in Ireland, do you think?
Well, there won't be a Sinn Féin government on its own. So, I mean, you're going to have a coalition after the next election again. That is for certain. No one party is going to win 80 plus seats in the Dáil. So there's going to be a coalition. Of course, in advance we have to have an election, and I think there's a long way to go yet in that particular space.
But that would
traditional voters, have their mind made up. But there's always a large floating group that, will look as you get nearer elections. At the moment, the polls are showing that it is very much with Sinn Féin, that floating vote, because historically they clearly wouldn't have been traditional Sinn Féin voters. But I just think there's a long way to go in that whole discussion. I'm a member of Fianna Fáil. We will play a significant role in Irish political life into the future. And certainly my hope is that we would be in government again in the next election. But there was a budget today in Ireland. We've come through a fairly, reasonable amount of challenges in historical terms through the financial crisis. But, we've had Brexit, we've had COVID, and yet the economy has shown remarkable resilience. I mean, a lot of the challenges we have are actually as a consequence of the fact that the economy is dynamic and growing. We have a housing challenge, which is very significant.
Right, this is one of the reasons why Sinn Féin is...
Yes, that is one of the areas where, I think could fracture society if we don't get it right. In other words, that you would have sort of, society breaking down versus those that have a home versus those that can't afford a home. And we have to try and get that resolved very, very quickly, because, as I said, that could fracture society. And we've had a fairly cohesive society in Ireland over years. We haven't been finger pointing at at people on the other side, or vice versa. We've firmly been in the centre. Fianna Fáil was always a broadly based party, so it attracted support from every socioeconomic grouping. And I believe we can continue to do that. But the one area which could fracture society and the political landscape is the issue of housing. So we have to resolve that.
Is it true that there are very few Eurosceptics in Ireland, that almost everyone is pro-EU?
Well, I mean, the vast majority of people are pro-European Union. In fact, when you look at the polls, the consistent tracking polls that are done by various European research institutes, etc., it shows that Ireland is very much a pro-European country. It hovers between 83 and 86%.
Right, and there's no Eurosceptic party?
Well, there is. I mean, the Sinn Féin and would have been
right?
traditionally a Eurosceptic party. I mean, clearly, let's be honest, I mean, they can move their position quite quickly to, mirror the public mood at the time. And they are now Eurocritical as opposed to Eurosceptic.
Right,
yes.
whatever that means.
That means that they're slowly but positively moving.
Proactive.
They just don't have the heart to tell their supporters yet.
And why is that? Why are the Irish so pro-EU?
Well, because in my view, I think there's a couple of historical reasons. Number one, we were colonised for many, many years. So we went through, centuries of trauma. We achieved independence in 1921. For probably the next 50 years, we were still very economically weak and dependent on the UK. We were just supplying basic commodities to the UK market. Around the late 50s, early 60s, we just began to look outward. And joining the European Union in 1973 was our footprint, or the door that opened the world to us. And if you look at the Irish economy now, I mean, any assessment of it shows it's one of the most dynamic, open, global trading economies. Our population has gone from, just shy of 3 million, or just over 3 million, to well over 5 million in those intervening 50 years. Our standard of living is high. We have a highly educated workforce. Multinationals see Ireland as a wonderful location. So
you're saying the success story is associated with the European Union?
Yes. I mean, our journey as a nation is very much a part of being a member of the European Union. It broke our economic dependence on the UK. And that was important as well, that you could export into the single market. You were able to attract multinationals into Ireland because we were a member of the single market at the time. So the journey of Ireland, the story of Ireland in terms of its economic outlook, its independence, its political independence, economic independence, and even culturally and emotionally as well, I think it has really allowed us to blossom as a nation. So it's part of our heartbeat.
Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much.